And we are live. Peace of the Lord to all of you. Welcome. So, we are here to talk about Jerusalem. People are probably familiar with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about on the channel and also with Lloyd, with problems with Mecca, historical problems, that there is no water and so on. But there's another piece of the jigsaw, a very important one, which is Jerusalem. In the beginning of the 7th century, we had the Persians, we have the Romans, and then the Arabs appear out of nowhere, and we have Islam, but people mostly ignore Jerusalem, but no more, because now we're trying to join the dots. And for that, we have Paul, who is going to present a lot of very cool information, making a claim of Jerusalem being very important to the formation of Islam. So, Paul, Odon, welcome. How are you, gentlemen?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you, and thank you very much for hosting me. This is it's quite important for me to launch my thesis in a proper, structured way. So thank you very much for giving me that opportunity.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be back with you guys and with the audience after a week of holidays in the Swiss Alps. It was very nice.
Great, welcome back. All right, well, Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll just see if I can share my screen. We had a practice earlier on. Do you see?
Yes, and if you can, yes, okay. So now we can all see the cover of your book.
Right. Well, it's quite an important week for me because I've now officially finished my book, which is called Jerusalem, City of Islam, the Quran's House of Allah, identified as the biblical House of Yahweh. And the general thesis, for those people who don't know, is that when the Quran talks about the House of God, the Masjid al-Haram, the Kaaba, the standing place of Abraham, it is all talking about the summit of Mount Moriah, which was where the Jerusalem temple used to stand. So it's been some years in the writing, this tome. It's 320,000 words, so not a quick read. Contains around about 3,000 references. I haven't counted them. I'm just taking a ballpark guess. So about 3,000 references to individual Quran verses, a similar number of Bible verses, references to more than 200 pre-modern texts, ancient chronicles or part of the Talmud and Syriac hymns and so on, and also 350 modern academic works. So it's quite thorough. It's taken a lot of making, and I'm rather pleased the job is now at an end. My pitch is that I think it is the most cogent, detailed, and comprehensive revisionist explanation for the Quran that has ever been produced up until this time. These are the content.
Paul, excuse me, yes, before you move on. So we've got a question here immediately from Juliet. So is Brother Paul's book on Amazon as yet? Is it actually published for the people to purchase, or will it take some time?
They're very pleased to get questions like that. That cheers my heart that there's anyone out there who actually wants to read my work. Yes, I can move on to the content here. The first 9 chapters are available now online, open access, free of charge to the world. So if anyone wants to read these, they can go on to academia.edu, and if you search there for Paul Ellis, City of Islam, I think you'll have no difficulty finding it. So that's first 9 chapters freely available, my gift to the world. My hope is that this will stir up a bit of debate. I need to try and get the academic community involved, maybe get Muslims interested in talking about it and seeing if they can refute my ideas, try and put more videos like this together get the message out there about what my book is about. And then at a future stage, when I've got everyone hooked and itching to see how the story ends, the final 5 chapters, you'll have to buy the book. And the book will be published on Amazon and maybe other sources as well. And it'll be on Kindle, but I'm afraid I have to pay for that because it won't be excessive. You need to buy me a coffee, as they say, in order to see how the story ends.
If I may, spoiler alert, the story ends with 80,000 Moroccans entering Spain unopposed.
Well, I don't know. The story hasn't ended, and the story won't end. How it will affect Islam, the world, Israel, if substantial numbers of Muslims are persuaded by my argument and decide that, yes, they are supposed to be praying to Jerusalem, and they are supposed to be making the Hajj to Jerusalem, that's going to be that could be quite interesting. So talking about the story ending, we might just be at the very beginning of an interesting phase in world history. Certainly my book is going to do nothing at all for the Mecca tourist board. I hope nobody out here has shares in those big hotels that the Saudis have been building, because I think they'll be quite empty in a few years' time. Okay, shall I proceed?
Oh, yes, please.
Yep. Okay. Yes. The first chapter is called A House Built on Sand, is generally explaining the reasons why one shouldn't take the traditional narrative seriously, or the flaws with it. We've been through these many times in great depth on this channel, so I wouldn't, and this and Lloyd's channel, so I wouldn't go into any depth on that here. I'll move straight on to chapter number 2, which sets out in general terms what I might call the Jerusalem dilemma. It's my variation on the Quranic dilemma, and what is and the issue is, if Jerusalem is important to the Bible, and if the Bible is important to the Quran, surely Jerusalem is where you'd expect the Quran also to be focused. So through the course of my book, I raise many very specific points about particular verses, showing why they have been misinterpreted over the centuries, and in fact refer to Jerusalem. But I won't be talking about any of those today. I'm just going to be taking a very broad brush approach and looking at the whole picture and saying why I think one would expect, if you start reading the Quran, you should expect it to be all about Jerusalem, and not about some place on the Arabian Peninsula. In my first section, we will talk about how important the Bible is to the Quran. Firstly, the Bible and the Quran talk generally about the same sorts of issues, the same themes. They both are concerned with promoting monotheism and rejecting idolatry and pagan worship, false gods, and so on. They're all concerned with God's creation of the heavens and the earth. Also of God sustaining mankind through his benevolence and his kindness, his bounty to humanity, for which humanity needs to respond with reverential remembrance of him, particularly through prayer and other rituals, and of course through righteous conduct towards one another and to abiding by God's law. That is our response to God's generosity to us. Inevitably, of the inevitability also of God's vindication of the righteous and his punishment of the wicked, the God of justice. And this may take place either within history, through God smiting wicked people or saving his servants, but whether it does or whether it doesn't, it will occur at the last day, when on the last day, The living will be gathered together with the dead who have been resurrected, and we will all face judgment together for our actions in life, which will result in life after death, for some people in heaven and for others in the hellfire. So these are all themes that are laid out in the Bible and which the Quran enthusiastically adopts and as its own, and takes forward and makes its own comment. I don't suggest here that the Bible and the Quran say the same thing. That would be going too far, but they address the same themes. And in the case of the Quran, which of course comes about 7 centuries after the last book of the Bible was finished, this is very self-consciously adopting the Quran. They're very adopting the biblical worldview.
Yeah.
Secondly, it's not just the same themes, but the Quran gets involved in the same telling stories of the same characters and the same stories. I've made here a little slideshow, a slide of some of the major biblical episodes that are referred to in the Quran. Adam and Eve and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the first murder by one of their sons against the other, the story of Noah's Ark, destruction of Lot's people, testing of Abraham, and so on and so forth. I don't need to read every one of these, but one gets and this is by no means exhaustive, but it shows that the Bible doesn't happen to refer to the Bible in passing occasionally from time to time just to illustrate a point, but it is heavily invested in the sacred history that is laid out in the Bible and returns to it again and again. And in fact, I would say that the Quran sees itself as the culmination of biblical history and asks its readers, its audience, to interpret the events of the Quran's own time through the prism of biblical history that has led up to that moment.
Great. If I may, in terms of characters, just for people to think about this, as you were saying this, I was just realizing, so if you read the Bible, in the Old Testament, every book will have the characters of what is happening at the time. Then when you get to the New Testament, then you're introduced to the new characters, those who are doing things at the time. So Elizabeth, John the Baptist, Mary, Jesus, the apostles, and so on. But when we look at the Quran, we actually don't get that at all. We get all of the old stories, just like you're showing here, Adam and Eve and Moses, all of them wrong, but still, the names appear. But we don't get the characters that are supposed to be doing things in the real world. We don't get the Sahaba. We don't have the wives of Muhammad. We don't have the parents of Muhammad. It has to be like deciphered. It's almost like there is no progression where they were writing this book as though it was, say, a new gospel or a new story, because there is no new characters in the book. You have to go outside to the rest of the traditions so that they explain things to you. And of course, we all have our very strong views as to how that happened. But yeah, the Quran doesn't have any or much or any new information with characters because they are just not there. So much of it has to be exegeted and figured out.
Yes, there may be an element in which we disagree on some aspects of this. Mm-hmm. I think that the Quran addresses a real situation. I think there is a prophet who is largely responsible for the Quran, not entirely, but he creates many of the words, and he refers to himself in the later surahs when he tells people to obey God and obey his prophet. He's talking about himself, I think. So we may have some disagreements on that. What you say is certainly correct. There's a gentleman, I forget it, Anderson, who talks about the prophets being flattened in the Quran, that they all say the same thing. They all say the same words. They all have the same accusations put against them, and the stories are all molded to say exactly the same thing as the prophet of Islam is saying. But that's for a future presentation. For now, my point really is that the Quran accepts all these stories as being true, and it quotes them as though everybody knows that they're true, and he adopts them for his own purpose. To think of a modern analogy, and this only really came to me today, it's rather like in the world of modern cinema. You might talk about a universe. You may talk about the Marvel universe, or the DC universe, or the Star Trek universe. It's a bit like that. The Quran author buys into the biblical universe, and he expects his audience to do so as well. And that's really as far as I really need to take it for these purposes. Uses the same distinctive vocabulary and turns of phrase. Now, this is something that is I think is quite new. I think anyone who's ever read the Quran would be able to know that King David and Abraham and Moses are in there. But this has only really come out in the last few decades, I think. So few people have really studied both the Bible and the Quran that I think a lot of these have slipped under the radar. But a good place for anybody who's interested in this to start would be Biblical Turns of Phrase in the Quran by Gabriel Said Reynolds, which is freely available online. And I've got just a selection here of some of the phrases that appear in the Quran that would be instantly recognizable to anybody who knows the Bible well. Phrases such as the camel passing through the eye of the needle, or something being as small as a mustard seed. The reference to the heavens being rolled up like a scroll on the last day, a very distinctive turn of phrase that appears in both the Bible and the Quran. Phrase "on that day" as a reference to the last day, very prevalent in both texts, both occasions. It occurs well over 100 times, and of course, classic: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I don't know if anyone wanted to make any comment on any of these, or wanted to add your own favorite one.
Well, it makes me think of, I think, I don't remember whether it was Stephen Shoemaker or Guillaume D who wrote this. I think it's in the Quran des Historiens, the historians' Quran. But the Quran can be understood as a biblical apocryphon. It was written hundreds of years after the Bible, but it's all within the biblical context. It's an apocryphon, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, that got a little bit of fun. And one of the... Sorry, go on.
No. I think the Quran, my take on that would be the Quran author, the prophet who is behind the Quran. I think there was a guy out there, and he probably was called something a bit, he might not have been called Muhammad, but he was called something a bit like Muhammad, or some variation on that. My take is that he saw himself as an Old Testament prophet, except he comes after Jesus. That's his problem. At the time of prophets has really gone by that stage. But in his mind, he's doing what Moses did, and he's trying to do it in his own time.
Or Daniel.
Yes. Well, perhaps he starts off as a Daniel, getting his messages from the angel Gabriel, and then becomes more of a Moses as time goes on. Maybe he ends up as a Joshua in due course.
Also, let's not forget that there is some sort of original content in the Quran, Arabic content, Arab legends, Arab characters.
Yes, although even there they're very strange. I'm not sure that anyone really knows who Salah and Hud are, but I think it's interesting that Salah means could be traced back etymologically to Hebrew as being a righteous person, and Hud is the name for Jew. It's the same word as appears for Jew. So it doesn't stray very far from Judaism. It doesn't. Anyway. I can't dawdle because I've quite a lot of material to get through. Same legal regime. I'm not going to go into any detail on this because it's a highly complicated issue. But what I can say is they both have as a starting point for physical injuries the lex talionis, the law of retribution, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and for yes, and a life for a life. They also have a range of specific rules. Perhaps the most famous and most obvious one would be both avoiding pork and the eating of pig produce, but there are many, many, many more, often very specific. And even the list of discretionary sanctions that appears in the Quran in Surah 5, verse 33, which to many people, including myself, when I started this, I thought, well, this is just something unusual to the Quran. Even that comes from a biblical source. I can refer to this. So in Surah 5:33, the authorities are told, or the approved sanctions are given, verily the recompense of those who wage war against God and his messenger and endeavor to work corruption on the earth are that they be killed or yusalabu, and I'll leave what that means for the time being, or that they have their hands and feet cut off from opposite sides, or that they be banished from the land. And this bears a very close resemblance to the way that King David ordered Rechab and Banar to be killed in 2 Samuel chapter 4, where it says, so at a command from David, the young men killed Rechab and Banar and cut off their hands and feet. So they've got the cut off the hands and feet, hanging them up. That's a translation, but in the Aramaic Targums, which is the way that the Old Testament would have been circulating in Arabia, it uses the same word, the same core word as Yusalabu, and by the pool in Hebron. So we have the same, or at least 3 out of the 4 in the same sequence: killed, cutting off hands and feet, and this sanction of Yusalabu. So again, something that one thinks in 5:33 is very distinctive for the Quran. If you look at it in a bit of detail, or look around, you find it's got a source in the Bible. And whoever wrote 5:33, in my view, was almost certainly aware of 2 Samuel 4 and was adopting the example of King David to make it into a legislative rule for the future. Oh, there we are. I've circled that word. And it's not simply inferences from similarities. There is actually explicit endorsement in the Quran of the Bible. It doesn't just not attribute its sources, but it says on several occasions quite clearly that it endorses the Torah and the Gospel and invites its audience to regard them as authoritative and valid, which is, of course, the Islamic dilemma that Chris Frost was writing about earlier this year. So here's one example of this in Surah 5 again, this time verses 43 to 47. How is it that when they come to thee, this is the divine voice talking to the Quranic mouthpiece, the locutus, how is it that when they come to thee for judgment, when they have the Torah wherein is Allah's judgment? Truly we sent down the Torah, wherein is a guidance and a light, by which the prophets who submitted judged those who were Jews, as did the sages and the rabbis, in accordance with such of Allah's scripture as they were bidden to preserve, and to which they were witnesses. And we sent Jesus, son of Mary, confirming the Torah that had come before him, and gave him the Injil, the gospel, wherein is a guidance and a light, confirming the Torah that had come before him as a guidance and an exhortation to the reverent. Let the people of the Injil judge by what Allah has sent down therein. Whoever judges not, it is they who are iniquitous. So I don't think there's any strength in the accusation that some people make, which is that the Quran author was copying from the Bible. He's making it absolutely clear and explicit that he expects his audience to know where he's getting this material from, and he's proud of it and he endorses it. So my conclusion at the end of this, conclusion number 1, is that the Quran presents itself as a continuation of the revelation that is contained within the Bible. As I said earlier, the Quran is part of the Bible universe, and this is the framework, the parameters within which the Quran sees the world. I don't know if anyone wants to make a comment at this stage. Casey?
I have a comment, but
Yeah, go on, Odon.
Your conclusion is based on the Islamic interpretation of the Quran, in which Muslims believe that the Quran talks about itself. But the word Quran in the Quran means Quran. I think it refers to another book. I think that the Quran, the word Quran in the Quran refers to another book than the Islamic Quran. And so what we have actually, what the Quran is, it's not a revelation per se. It's a sort of commentary on the other book. It's a sort of a gathering of proclamation that were made in order to present the other book, the Quran, the lectionary, to an Arab audience. But I can follow you, even if I don't agree with you 100%.
Now we might have to agree to disagree upon this. But Odon, in your view, does the Quran purport to give the words of God? Does it purport to be any revelation at all, when it seems to be worded as the divine I and we and the prophetic you? Do you think that the Quran is purporting to put words in God's mouth, or do you think this has all been misunderstood?
Yeah, but I think it's a rhetoric tactic from the preacher, from Muhammad. He impersonates God. He impersonates God, and yes, it's nothing new. We have the same in the Bible.
That's right. Isaiah would say, "The Lord says this," and then the prophet will say what the prophet thinks. People need to hear.
Just as to imagine that the preacher Muhammad, he was presenting a book to his Arab audience. This book was a lectionary. In Arab, it's Quran. And the Islamic Quran was made out of the collection of notes and drafts that were written in order to prepare all these proclamations. So during the proclamation, you can imagine that Muhammad said, I have here a Quran. In this Quran, which is a lectionary, you will find excerpts of the sacred scriptures of the Bible. So it is the word of God inside, even though it's not the Bible, it's a lectionary. So it's as good as God's word. It is God's word. And so when I proclaim what is in the Quran, I proclaim God's word. So in a sense, in this sense, it can be understood as a revelation.
Well, when I should just clarify that when I say the Quran here in this slide and generally in this presentation, I'm referring to the canon, the Quran as we have it today. That's my name for that collection of texts, those 114 surahs. The Quran that is referred to within that, that can't possibly be the completed Quran, because it hadn't been completed when the words are still being revealed. It has to be something else. There was no Quran when the Quran was being revealed. The Quran only came into existence when it was edited and put together after some years after the Prophet's death.
If I may, just in case that this actually helps, like with the with this expression. So the way that I see it, and particularly with the word continuation, I would say yes. Well, like absolutely, it is the Abrahamic faith. You read the Quran, and it's not based on Buddhism or Zoroastrianism. It's within the Abrahamic faith. Is like you've shown the Islamic dilemma. Is actually saying, hey, the Torah is very good. The Injil is very good. So it is a part of all of that. Culture initially. The problem really does come when then people come later and they start imposing things into the text and making it say something very, very different by changing the meaning of the words. And during the process of editing as well, a lot of things would have fallen off. But initially, it would certainly would have been not seen as, okay, we have now completely new revelation. Would have been seen as, yes, this is part of the whole thing, just as how, say, an apostle would have been seen when he went around preaching the gospel for the first time. People would see him with something new, but there are a lot of people who actually know what it is. There are the other people preaching the gospel in other lands. So something more along those lines, that yes, it is still packaged within the Abrahamic faith, but the big difference that we have is the contemporary one, because they did change the meaning, and we see the Quran saying things that Islam contradicts and says they're shirk and things like that. But yeah, as a continuation, part of the whole Abrahamic faith, part of the Bible, yeah, I would have no problem with
I think the Quran. Yeah, I think the people who are writing it, and more than one person would have had a hand in it, but they envisage this as in a sense a continuation of the Quran. That would be of the Bible. That would be my. They don't contradict the Bible. They don't say it's completely independent and separate. They seem to carry on the story as though the Bible hasn't finished yet, as though there's more still to come. Is my take on this. Perhaps the Quran would be a third book of the Bible, possibly in their view. Right. At this point, we have to turn to the temple, the role of the temple in the Bible. Now, I was brought up a Catholic with very pious Catholic parents. I attended Catholic school. I've attended Mass all my life, joined some Catholic societies at university, and I don't remember anyone really talking to me very much about the temple. It seems to have passed by me. Maybe it's passed by some other Christians, and I think we need to understand how important the temple is in the Bible in order to understand how the Quran later treats this. So I'm going to quickly, and perhaps not very quickly, I'm going to spend a few minutes going through all the significance of the temple in the Bible. For some people, those who know the Bible better than I was taught it, this may be all very familiar stuff. But I think it all needs to be said, because maybe other people like myself, for whom part of it have been overlooked and played down in the modern world. So the story really begins, as far as the temple is concerned, with the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. This is Abraham has been brought to Canaan, and he makes a covenant with God, a land covenant. God says he'll give the land to the descendants of Abraham, but as part of a test of his obedience, he has to sacrifice his son Isaac at a place that God tells him about and which shows him, and in a place in the land of Moriah. And of course, in the book of Genesis, chapter 22, Abraham shows his obedience to God, and he's prepared to kill Isaac until an angel intervenes at the last moment and replaces him with a goat. Thereafter, Abraham's grandson Joseph. Joseph finds himself in Egypt through no willingness of himself, but brings his brothers down to Egypt. The Israelites find themselves becoming slaves of the Egyptians, and then Moses leads them out of slavery generations later, and they're wandering in the wilderness. And this is when they form the detailed covenant with God, with Yahweh, and This is written down in the 10 Commandments, which are placed within the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle to preserve them. Now, Yahweh tells the Israelites that he will dwell with his people in the Ark, or on the Ark of the Covenant, and in the tabernacle. So he dwells on the Ark, and then if you put the Ark inside the tabernacle, he dwells inside the tabernacle as well. Now, this isn't some woolly turn of phrase. It would be, it's quite customary now for Christians to rather loosely refer to a church or a chapel as the house of God, or how dare you do this in a house of God. But this is much more specific than that, much more literal. In Exodus chapter 25, Yahweh commands Moses, there on the Ark of the Covenant, I shall come to meet you. From above the caperet, that's the lid, which has these golden cherubim on them, from between the two cherubim, which are the Ark of the Testimony, from there I will give all my orders to the Israelites. So God specifies a very particular point on the Ark of the Covenant where he will come to meet his people. And if this is all, with any doubt about how literally this is, when the Ark of the Covenant is placed inside the tabernacle, there is a theophany, a revelation of God's presence upon the earth. This is in Exodus chapter 40. As the Ark is placed in the covenant, a cloud covered the meeting tent, and the glory of Yahweh filled the dwelling. Moses could not enter the meeting tent because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the dwelling. So it's a very physical presence. And thereafter, Yahweh is present to the Israelites in the form of a column of cloud in the daytime, a column of fire at night. So it's a very real, very physical presence in the Torah that God has on the Ark of the Covenant. Well, when the Israelites capture and settle Canaan, King David captures Mount Jabus, and from there he is led by the angel of the Lord to a particular place, which is the threshing floor of Odon the Jebusite. And there he is told this is where he has to build a permanent temple for God, and then the Ark of the Covenant will be put inside the temple rather than the temporary tabernacle of the wilderness. David doesn't build it himself, it's left it to his son Solomon. So Solomon builds a temple and installs the Ark of the Covenant. When he does so, a theophany occurs again, which is quite clearly worded to replicate the theophany that occurred with Moses back in the wilderness. On the order of Solomon, the elders of Israel and all the elders of the tribe, the princes of the ancestral houses of the Israelites, came to King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of Yahweh's covenant from the city of David, which is in Zion. So it's left on a different hill, which is Mount Zion, and it's brought over to where they've built the temple on the threshing floor of Odon the Jebusite. The priests brought the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh to its place beneath the wings of the cherubim. These are giant cherubim statues built in the sanctuary, in the Holy of Holies of the temple. When the priests left the sanctuary, the cloud filled the house of Yahweh, so the priests could no longer minister because of the cloud, since the glory of Yahweh filled the house of Yahweh. So you see, this is a very, very similar, deliberately similar wording, a very similar idea to what happened in the covenant, and it shows that God's glory, which had existed in the tabernacle in the wilderness, is now been transferred to the temple. Solomon says, Yahweh intends to dwell in the dark cloud. I have truly built you a princely house where you may abide forever. So very similar words to those which are used for the Ark of the Covenant in the wilderness. A little later on, it is revealed in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and in 2 Samuel chapter 24 that Mount Jabus, where this temple was built, was in fact Mount Moriah. This is revealed to be the very same mountain to which Abraham had been led by Yahweh to sacrifice Isaac. That is to say, the tablets containing the 10 Commandments and the ark that contains them were resting over the very place where Abraham had made the epic demonstration of faith that had made the covenant possible, that had sealed the covenant with God. So the Israelites' occupation of Canaan was entirely dependent upon this covenant with God, and now the tablets, which reflect the law of God, rest upon the place where Abraham had sealed the deal, as it were. Now, the Temple of Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC, but not to worry, because a second temple was built in 516 BC. There are no theophanies, as far as I know, that are associated with the second temple. However, it is still spoken of as the house of Yahweh. So it's still called the house of Yahweh, even though the Ark of the Covenant is no longer there, even though there's no longer a cloud representing the glory of God that prevents priests from going into it. Nevertheless, it is still referred to by Jewish prophets as the house of Yahweh. One learning point for me, as I was researching this, is that this is also true for the evangelists. So this is true in the Gospels, that up until the death of Jesus, the evangelists still agree, or particularly St. Luke, that God continues to live in the second temple in a unique and special way. Here I've got a list of 4 passages which make the point. In Luke chapter 1, it talks about Zacharias fulfilling his functions as a priest before God. And when he receives a revelation of the birth of John the Baptist, he does so whilst he is in the sanctuary of the Lord. In the following chapter, in Luke chapter 2, Jesus is taken to the temple so that he can be presented to the Lord. And when he's lost and then found again, Jesus says to his parents, "Did you not know that I must be in the place of my Father?" In the Gospel of St. Matthew, Jesus says that anyone who swears by the temple is swearing by it and by him who dwells there. And perhaps the most famous passage, as Jesus is cleansing the temple of the moneylenders, he's saying, he quotes Isaiah, saying, "My," meaning Yahweh's house, "shall be called a house of prayer, but you're turning it into a den of thieves." So in all these passages, the evangelists, Luke and Matthew, although also Mark and John for the last one, seems to accept that for the lifetime of Jesus, the temple continues to be the house of God, the dwelling place of the Lord amongst the Israelites. This temple, the second temple, is then destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, approximately 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. That is not the end of it. For Christians, the temple now becomes us. The destruction of the temple by the Romans in AD 70 is the lens through which the evangelists and all the Gospels, I think, came to their fullness. Some of them might contain earlier material, but they all, I think, it is generally thought, reached their final form after the destruction of the temple. And the destruction of the temple is the lens through which they tell the story of Jesus's death and resurrection. So they spend some time having Jesus foretelling the destruction of the temple, and to my opinion, in quite emotional and dramatic language. And of course, Jesus isn't really just describing the destruction of the temple, he's also talking of his own death as he does so. Jesus identifies his own body with the temple. He says, they'll destroy the body and it'll rise again in 3 days. And the temple that he was talking of was his own body. And perhaps the most dramatic moment is in Matthew 27:51, which is at the very moment when Jesus breathed his last upon the cross. The veil of the temple is rent asunder from top to bottom, illustrating that for St. Matthew, the presence of God remains in the temple whilst Jesus is alive. But at the moment that Jesus dies, a new covenant has been brought into effect, and we no longer need the temple, and the Holy of Holies is redundant, as is demonstrated by the rending of the veil. I have to say, this for much of my life, the significance of this hadn't really been explained to me. And St. Paul, who may have been writing before the destruction of the temple, or he was writing before the destruction of the temple, he preempts it, he anticipates it by talking of the church as being the temple of God's people. So I've got a few quotations here from St. Paul. Are you, 1 Corinthians, are you not aware that you are the temple of God? Talking to his audience of the Corinthians, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and you are that temple. Do you not know that your body is a temple? I should try and remember this a little bit more, of the Holy Spirit. You are a temple of the living God, and so on. So, the temple, although the temple is physically destroyed in AD 70, and to my mind has rather lapsed from the way Christians talk about their faith on a day-to-day level, for the evangelists, this was a hugely important event, and it is the prism, the way through which they explain the death of Jesus, and Jesus himself is saying that he wants people to understand the death of the destruction of the temple as being connected intimately with his own sacrifice on the cross. The cosmic mountain and the navel of the world. The temple is much more than simply a place where God's presence dwells. The Hebrew Bible associates the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle of the Wilderness, and later on the temple, with the Garden of Eden. Now, some of the language here is rather technical. I won't go into it in detail. If you read the relevant passages of my book, you'll get all the references. But I'll give you just one example, one for instance of this. And that is in the book of Ezekiel. In chapter 20, it talks about the temple on Mount Moriah, and it says, for on my holy mountain, on the high mountain of Israel, declares Yahweh Elohim, is where the whole house of Israel, everyone in the country, will worship me, and there bring your gifts, which I expect is right, your choicest offering and all your consecrated gifts. However, 8 chapters later, Ezekiel is talking about the Garden of Eden. He says, in Eden, in the garden of Elohim, you were. With the cherub I placed you, you were on the holy mountain of Elohim, walking amongst the fiery stones. And you will spot that he uses the same phrase, my holy mountain, or the holy mountain of Elohim, to refer on the one hand to Mount Moriah, which is where the temple is, where he wants people to bring their sacrifices and their gifts, and where worship will take place, and also the Garden of Eden, which is where humanity began, where God once walked with man, and where we will one day receive the beatific vision if we are fortunate enough to be admitted. So in Jewish thought, the Mount Moriah was seen as closely connected, and the temple very closely connected with the Garden of Eden, which was often pictured as though it was on Mount Moriah, perhaps on a mystical cosmic mountain that is above the actual physical mountain that will become known on the last day.
Paul, if I may, just a quick thing. In the Jewish tradition, I think it's in the Pirkei from Rabbi Eliezer, it is said that Adam was created in Eden, of course, but it was created from the dust of the Temple Mount of Mount Moriah. So there is another level of connection between the temple and
Yes.
the Garden of Eden.
Yes, absolutely. Although I think, doesn't Perkei Rabbi Eliezer, doesn't that come slightly after the Quran? Because that's a very interesting book that I think I make many references to that, but I think it actually comes after the Quran, so I'm not sure we can assume that the Quran author would knew about it, but the tradition may well have been there earlier. And it links in with my next bullet point, or the one after it, which is that Isaiah had a vision of Yahweh's throne directly above the temple, such that the hem of Yahweh's garment actually, you have to imagine it, the Yahweh on his throne, and in the vision, the hem of Yahweh's robe would come down and part of it would actually fill the temple. Here we are in Isaiah chapter 6. In the year of King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne with the train of his garment filling the temple. So in Isaiah's idea, the throne of God, not just paradise, but the throne of God is actually directly above the Jerusalem temple. Now it follows, or to Jewish thought, it follows from this that if in the book of Genesis, if Yahweh's throne had been over the waters when God first created the land, made the land out of the chaos, if God's throne had been above the waters then, and if God's throne was directly above the temple, it must follow that the foundation stone of the temple must have been the first land to emerge from the water. So, since Yahweh had created the world while his throne was above the waters, the idea developed that the summit of Mount Moriah was, and I'm here quoting from Angelica Neuwirth, the first created place from which the rest of the world grew concentrically like a fetus from the umbilical cord. So you've got to imagine God creating the earth and this stony seed from which all the continents, all the lands later developed as it comes out of the water. And if it was underneath God's throne, then that must be the very same. And if God's throne is over the temple, that must be the very place where the temple is. And I'm sure, Odon, that this is the inspiration for the Rabbi Eliezer saying that the dust from which Arab, or the clay from which Adam was created, was found from the very same place. Here I've got a medieval map. Comes from much later, but you will see here Jerusalem, like the bullseye, in the center of the world, and it is described by the prophet Ezekiel as the navel of the world. In 38:12, the navel of the world fitting in nicely. Shows the inspiration for Angelica Neuwirth's idea that there is an umbilical cord linking the earth to the heavens via Jerusalem, the belly button of the whole world. We're getting to the end, just two more to do. You've also got the importance of the temple in the last day. The last trumpet will be blown on Mount Zion, heralding the last day and the end of history. That will be started by somebody, the prophet Joel says that the last trumpet will be blown on Mount Zion. Humanity will all be gathered for judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat. And where is the valley of Jehoshaphat? It is formed by the eastern slope of Mount Moriah. So where the Kidron Valley is now formed between Mount Moriah and the Mount of Olives, this will be widened to create a great plain for the judgment of mankind. So here we have Prophet Joel, blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. That phrase again. Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Blow the trumpet and call an assembly. And then later on, chapter 4, I will assemble all the nations, bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which means the judgment of God, I believe. And Zechariah 14 says, on that day, his feet, that's God's feet, will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives will be, I'm afraid I can't read that word because of the way my computer's set up. It'll be split, I think, from east to west, forming a great valley with half the mountain moving north and half moving south. So great earth moving operation, but this will take place on the eastern slope of Mount Moriah, so that from Temple Mount, God or his Messiah will be able to judge the people gathered before him. And finally, after, that's not the end, after we have been judged, paradise is depicted by Isaiah in the Old Testament and in the book of Revelation by St. John of Patmos as a new Jerusalem. Often paradise is depicted as a garden, the Garden of Eden, but here is depicted in an urban form. And how would you describe paradise? Well, it's a new Jerusalem. So just as we humans will be resurrected and be given new bodies, unlike our earthly bodies, so God will raise up Jerusalem, and we'll have a new Jerusalem with streets of gold and diamonds and precious jewels. Meanwhile, for those unfortunate enough or deserving not to be included in this, the hellfire is associated, particularly by Jesus, with the valley of Gehenna, which is formed by the south slope of Mount Moriah. So the east slope is the valley of Jehoshaphat, the south slope is a valley of Gehenna, which is where the wicked will be cast like darnel into the undying flames. Jesus says, fear not them who kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but fear him who is able to, meaning God, who is able to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna. So, to adopt an image set out in the Sefer Yetzirah, which is a mystical Jewish text of an unknown date, the foundation stone of the Jerusalem temple occupied in Jewish thought a central position on multiple axes. It was the epicenter of the physical world. It was also the point at which the earthly plane meets the vertical axis between paradise above and on the cosmic mountain above Mount Moriah, and also the hellfire at the base of the mountain. It also formed a temporal bridge, connecting the first act of creation to the end of history on the last day. So I've put this in a diagrammatic form. In short, it was perceived within Judaism as a sort of singularity, where north, south, east, and west, the heavens and the underworld, the beginning and the end, all meet. And this will be the unavoidable destination of each soul's journey, where righteousness and sin will be weighed to a nicety and individuals designated as saved or damned. So in short, I would say it's hard to envisage how it might have been possible for any religious tradition to invest in any earthly location with greater importance. Right. So conclusion number 2, in the Bible, Jerusalem is consistently present as a uniquely sacrosanct place upon the earth and the house of God. Any comments, gentlemen?
Odon, you go first.
I see where you're going, Paul. Just a short remark on the Gehenna. It had a bad reputation because it was the place where the priests and the attendants dumped all the trash from the sacrifices. So the ashes, the unburned carcasses of the animals that were sacrificed. And so the image of the Gehenna is the place where it's a sort of dumping ground that must stink with flies and so on. So this is why it's also an image for the for hell.
Yeah, there was it not associated with human sacrifice as well?
Human
back in the day?
sacrifice. Oh,
Yeah, back in the day, before the Israelites settled Canaan.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
I think there's something called the Tophet, and I don't think anyone's ever been quite clear what the Tophet was. Perhaps JC knows. But I walked through the Valley of Gehenna. I took my dear wife when we were in Jerusalem at Christmas time. I took my dear wife on a walk through the Valley of Hell. Never let it be said that I don't show her a good time. And I have to say, it was raining. It was raining continuously, and it was very wet. But apart from that, it looked quite pleasant. But they've now got a rather nice footbridge over it, so you can look down on the valley of Gehenna from a safe height, without risking one's soul by going too close to it.
I would have another remark, is that all this discourse about Jerusalem being the navel of the world, it also exists in the Islamic tradition. There are books about Jerusalem within this tradition from the 9th or 10th century that actually sort of copied the Jewish tradition.
Oh, as is everything. Allah's throne is above the Kaaba in the and yes, and Adam lived
it's not about Mecca, it's
Mecca.
About Jerusalem
within
the Islamic tradition, still being considered as the place of the judgment, and as being a center of the world. So there is a contradiction here with Mecca.
Yes. JC, any comments? I mean, do you share my view, or do you share my experience, or recognize my experience, JC, that nobody ever explains this to you as a child? This is something that you find out as an adult, but nobody ever sat down and told me about the importance of the temple and the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, well, I was an atheist, so I'm a new Christian. But yes, I was thrown into all of this in the mixture with Islam, and then I started to recognize very early on that the whole Bible is read with Jerusalem at its center, all the way up to Revelation. In the Old Testament as well, when the Israelites are taken to Babylon, they're just thinking about coming back. It's always about Jerusalem. And this is as well what is happening in the news. So I knew almost instinctively that it is central, but it's only when I have spoken with Jewish people that I see that to them, let's put it this way, is a lot more important than to us Christians, because the temple is basically what they have to rebuild. But yeah, you're absolutely right. But everything goes even up to the book of Revelation. Jerusalem is always at the center. So another comment I wanted to make: very nice presentation so far. Particularly the previous slide, I have really liked that one actually. With that animation was very cool. So something that you showed before that just made me think about something. It's a little bit off topic, but if you don't mind, when you showed the passage in the Bible that says, Jesus says, and whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. Now that reminded me of quite a few things in Islam that says something quite similar, to a degree. There is the bit of Muhammad placing the Torah and saying, I believe in you and he who revealed you. But then there is this other thing about, I swear by this sacred city or by this city as well. And then in the traditions of Muhammad saying that he used to swear by the Kaaba, and then someone saying, you cannot swear by the Kaaba, you have to swear by the Lord of the Kaaba. So just by having in the Bible Jesus saying that, and then we have these weird things in the Islamic traditions about swearing by a place, like basically a city or something. Do you think there is some sort of relation? Are they completely disjointed? Do you have any thoughts about that as a connection?
Yes, well, I think there are two surahs that start with many of the early surahs begin with oaths, and one assumes that the God's allowed to swear by things. So the things are sworn by the pen or by the sun or so on. There are two surahs that begin the swear by the land, by Hada Balad, by this land. On one case, by this Balad Amin, I think that's Surah 95. And I think that when whoever is writing this swears by this land, he's talking about the temple. One of them says, and who dwells here. It says, by the land, and you dwell in the land. I think it's talking about God dwelling in the temple. That would be my. So I think there is a direct connection between Matthew 23:21 and the Quran. Surah 85, I think.
Okay, cool. Very then direct connection. So certainly not by Mecca, where there is no water, no food, no people, no nothing.
No, you swear,
so
at,
Jerusalem
swear at that land. Don't swear by it. Yes. Great. Super. So let's get on to the Quran. I'll get back to the Quran. One might have thought that if the Quran is so heavily influenced, somebody has used the phrase saturated, so saturated with biblical references, biblical paraphrases, biblical characters and stories, biblical themes. We might have thought, and Jerusalem being so central to the Bible, that the Quran would also mention Jerusalem. Now, it's sometimes incorrectly said that the Quran does not mention Jerusalem. That's not true. The Quran might not name Jerusalem, but it mentions it plenty. So let's go through this. The Promised Land is referred to in the Quran. Surah 21. Abraham and Lot settled in the land that it's in the divine voice, that's Allah, had blessed for all the worlds. So that's a reference to Abraham and Lot settling in Canaan. So Canaan is treated in the Quran as the land that Allah has blessed for all the worlds. 10 verses later, it talks about the kingdom of Solomon and says that in those days, the wind ran by Solomon's command throughout the land that we had blessed. That's Allah again, had blessed the land. Surah 7, the Israelites, it talks about the Israelites having been bequeathed the eastern and western parts of the land that we blessed. I think the eastern and the western parts, Nikolai Sinai wrote an excellent article. It's referring to Egypt. So in the Quran, they think Egypt is part of the Holy Land. But that aside, it's clear that he's talking about the land that has been promised to the Israelites, being again the land that we have blessed, being blessed by God. Surah 5, verse 21, the divine voice addresses the Israelites in his recollection and says to them, enter the sanctified land, sometimes you might say the Holy Land, which Allah has written down and ordained for you. So on at least 4 occasions, I think there are another 2, perhaps not quite as compelling as this, but at least on these 4 occasions, it is quite clear that the land that has been promised to the Israelites is regarded in the Quran as being specially blessed or sanctified. So I don't think it's unreasonable to talk about the Holy Land in terms of the Quran approach towards Canaan or Palestine, Israel now. 4 episodes in the Quran are set in royal palaces that we have to assume must have been in Jerusalem. In Surah 38, 2 people with an argument entered into David's mihrab. This is generally regarded as being David's palace. When David had captured the fortress of the Jebusites, he built his palace on Mount Jebus, which is and it's referred to in the Song of Songs, where it talks about the male party describes the Shulamite bride as having a neck like David's tower. So this all looks like it's David's mihrab. It has to be in Jerusalem. Where would David be if he wasn't in Jerusalem? A little later in the same surah has a rather strange story of Solomon stroking horses. It's not actually that pleasant why Solomon is stroking his horses, but we'll leave that for now. Read my book if you want to know the gory story about what's going on there. But where are horses? The Bible talks about Solomon having very many horses and having vast stables, thousands of stalls in his stables for the horses that he has, and then moves on to a story of a shape-shifting demon, Asmodeus or Ashmedai, usurping Solomon from his throne and actually sitting on Solomon's throne. Well, where would Solomon's throne be? This would have to be in Solomon's palace, and the throne, Solomon's throne, is described in the Bible in a new palace that he builds actually on Temple Mount. So Solomon's palace is different to David's palace. Surah 34 has Solomon urging the jinn to construct great buildings. Again, this has got to be a reference to Jerusalem, because in the Jewish tradition, Solomon used Ashmedai when he finally got his throne back from Ashmedai and was able to conquer him. Solomon used Ashmedai to use his miraculous or magical powers to construct the temple, because it wouldn't have been possible by human efforts alone. So this again is a reference to Jerusalem. And of course, the visit of the Queen of Sheba to Solomon's palace again has to take place in Jerusalem. So when people say Jerusalem's not mentioned in the Quran, here you've got 4 passages in which the royal palaces of the kings of Israel are mentioned, and in all 4 of them they've really got to be a reference to Jerusalem. I've got an interesting note here on the word mihrab, or the plural form meharib. The word mihrab occurs 4 times in the Quran, and the plural form once. King David's, we've mentioned the 2 disputants break into King David's mihrab to put their argument before him in Surah 38:21. King Solomon builds mihrab with the help of the jinn, or he gets a jinn to build them for him in Surah 34:13. Surah 3 and Surah 19 both refer to Zechariah being in the mihrab, which is clearly a reference to the sanctuary of the temple, because the Surah 19 in particular very closely resembles a passage of in the Gospel of St. Luke, where Zechariah has the revelation from an angel and comes out and is unable to speak. It's quite clearly referring to the same situation, so it has to be in the sanctuary of the temple. And later on, Mary is raised in the mihrab, where she receives sustenance from angels, and that's in Surah 3 verse 37. So what I find very telling is that on all 5 occasions that the word mihrab appears in the Quran, it is a reference to a building or buildings in Jerusalem. This doesn't have to be a radical revisionist theory. A Muslim would accept this. A Muslim would quite reasonably accept that King David's mihrab, King Solomon, Zechariah and Mary, they were all in Jerusalem when this occurred. And so the mihrab seems to have a very specific reference in the Quran to Jerusalem. The Quran was clever with his use of words. One of the great errors I think people make is to think that the guy who wrote the Quran, or this primary author, wasn't very bright. He was very clever. There's lots of word smithery involved in there. And it looks to me fairly clear that he has made a deliberate, conscious decision to preserve this one word for Jerusalem. Now, where do we know mihrab from? This is the niche that is installed in mosques. In every mosque, you've got a little prayer niche which is directed towards Mecca. But I think this is a pretty clear-cut case that the Quran, though the Islamic tradition, has taken a word that the Quran clearly intends to use to direct the audience's mind to Jerusalem, and use it to point in the opposite direction towards Mecca. and this is, I think, a fairly clear-cut version, and to my mind sets a good precedent for what I claim later occurs with the Masjid al-Haram, the Kaaba, the Maqam Ibrahim, and so on, and the mother of cities. I don't know, any comments on this, gentlemen?
I would like to ask a question, and I think it might actually be more for Odon because of all of the work that Odon has done on how the Quran was put together and so on. And it's following on from this comment from Eric. Is it possible that the word was censored? So do you gentlemen, well, I think we will probably all agree that the Quran now is not the Quran that was first written down. Much has been edited, much has been taken out, and so on. So do you think that originally there were probably verses that mention, say, Jerusalem by name, but then during the editing process, they just removed them because it was inconvenient? Do you think something like this happened, or do you have a different idea?
It could have happened, but you see, at this early stage, it was not the Quran yet, not the Islamic Quran. It was something else. It was a collection of Arabic texts with religious value, but it was in no way a divine revelation. So yeah, it might have happened. This is the issue we have with the Quran. It's the sort of lamplight situation where we look at the evidence we have. You know the story of the guy who looks for his keys under the light of a lamplight in the street during the night, and he only looks under the lamplight because it is the only place where there is light, and of course he won't find his keys there. So yeah, it might be that that some words were edited out, but we have to do with what we have, and here we have evidence that Jerusalem is mentioned. Directly mentioned in the Quran. I would have a little remark. It's about King David's mihrab. It could be understood as the tabernacle or the tent of in which the sanctuary was set. Because David, when he settled in Jerusalem, he had this tent. He had it set somewhere, and I think he might have set it on Mount Moriah, the tent that contained the Ark of the Covenant and so on. So before the temple was built, there still was there was a sanctuary or a mihrab. So it might be his palace, or it might be the a sort of a pre-temple, a tent temple.
But still, it's Jerusalem. It's the yes, and the words to answer my point, like Odon, I would say we don't know what we don't know. If something's been lost, we don't know what it might have said, except that I think the Quran author has his own style. And if he doesn't use the word Jerusalem in any of these passages, it seems to be that he's chosen not to use that word. So it may well be that I'm sure we've lost lots of Quran. We don't have the whole of it, but it may well be that even the bits we've lost, it doesn't. It wouldn't have mentioned it because he's chosen not to name it. People think that's an argument against the Jerusalem thesis, by the way. People say, oh, well, Jerusalem isn't named in the Quran, therefore it can't be Jerusalem. But all these episodes are clearly based in Jerusalem or based in the Holy Land. So if they're not mentioned, that proves or that indicates that the Quran author has made a decision not to name it. It doesn't mean he's made it a decision that is not relevant, because all these passages are relevant to it. Anyway, what about the temple? Is the temple referred to in the Quran? Yes, at least two episodes, or two sections. One is in the prologue to the birth of Jesus. Jesus is a bit unusual in the Quran in having quite a long build-up to his life. But all sorts of episodes seem to take place in and around the temple. The revelation of a future child, John the Baptist, to Zechariah occurred in the mihrab, and as I've said, the passage in the Quran relates very closely to the analogous passage of the equivalent passage in St. Luke. Mary is said to have been raised in Zechariah's mihrab. This is not in the Bible, but it is in the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi, which was around long before the Quran. This pious tradition that Mary was raised at the temple. The story of the angels miraculously feeding Mary is there. The selection of a husband for Mary. Mary's miraculous conception of Jesus, of course. So all these episodes take place in the Quran within the temple. So the temple is not only mentioned as in a story, but is mentioned as a particularly important, particularly sacred place. Why would the Quran say that that Mary was raised in the temple if it wasn't to symbolize that it was a very important, very special, holy place? Oh, yes, and finally, when Jesus had been born and Mary returns to Jerusalem and is accused of sexual impropriety by the people of Jerusalem, and Jesus stands up as a child and defends his mother, as a newborn baby, defending his mother, and this must be assumed to take place in Jerusalem as well. And the Muslims had a little shrine within the Temple Mount in the Stables of Solomon, where they say this incident occurred. I'm not sure I go that far, but the obvious implication is it took place in Jerusalem. The other passage is from Surah 17, shortly after the controversial night journey. There is a revelation that the Banu Israel, that's the children of Israel, would rebel twice, and that enemies would enter their homes and their masjid, and twice. And that this is, I think, a fairly clear reference. The whole passage isn't clear. There's a lot to be said about that. I could talk for 2 hours just on that at some stage in the future. But the fact that it's on one level, it refers to the two destructions of the temple, once by the Babylonians and once by the Romans. And these are the two incidents in which the children of Israel would have their homes and their sacred place entered. I think that's not disputed. I think Muslims would agree with that as well. Okay.
Just a quick remark, Paul. You surely know this, but I was looking in your PDF, but I didn't find it. All the mentions of Mary in the sanctuary, in the temple, they are taken or copied from the proto-gospel of James, biblical apocryphon. Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's not an invention. It's like the story of Jesus creating birds from out of clay. There were stories that were told among Arabs. That have been translated, and this is the reason why they are in the Quran.
Absolutely. The reason it's not in my free sample, it's in the five. It's in the 5 chapters you have to buy the book for. But yes, to me, it's very important to me that the Quran at one stage talks about the presence of God, the Shekinah, being in the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant is in Surah Al-Baqarah, and the Ark of the Covenant was put in the temple. Now, the reason why the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi has Mary being raised in the temple is because in Christian thought she is the Ark of the New Covenant. Mary sits where the Ark of the Covenant had formerly sat because her womb is the Ark of the New Covenant. And if the Quran is accepting that God's Spirit is in the Ark of the Covenant, which I think it does, and if it accepts that Mary was raised at the temple, it seems very close to saying that the God's presence is in the temple, that the God's, yes, the presence of God must have been in the temple, at least at some stage, in which case it would be appropriate to call the Jerusalem temple the house of God, even in the terms of the Quran. So, but that's all in the 5 chapters that you have to buy, not in the free 9 chapters that I'm giving away. Okay, moving on to the eschatological landscape. Does the eschatological aspect of Jerusalem appear in the Quran? Yes, it does. The Quran makes references to a trumpet being blown on the last day. It doesn't say where this will take place. Curiously, it says it'll be in a place nearby. Make of that what we will. But in the Islamic tradition, this will take place in Jerusalem, and this looks like a clear reference to Joel, saying that the trumpet will be blown on Mount Zion. It talks about humanity being gathered together on a great plain, and again, this looks to me as though it's just accepting or adopting, I wouldn't say copying, but it's accepting the prophecies of Joel and Zechariah that humanity will be gathered on this great plain, and why not make it the plain of Jehoshaphat that will be made by the leveling off of the Mount of Olives. And these are accepted, I think, within the Islamic tradition as prophecies that relate to Jerusalem. So in the more mystical Islamic tradition, they'll say that on the last day, Mecca, the Kaaba, will come to Jerusalem, will be magically brought to Jerusalem as a bride to its wedding. I think this is very, the Quran seems to accept, or the Islamic tradition accepts, that the last day will all take place in and around Jerusalem. So all these references to trumpets and the Great Plain of Judgment must also be regarded as references to Jerusalem in the Quran. And the Quran refers to hell as Jahannam, which is clearly an Arabic form of Gehenna, and it does so 77 times. So this is possibly the most prevalent reference to Jerusalem in the Quran. Whatever says Jerusalem's not mentioned in the Quran, you can turn around and say, yes, but the valley of Gehenna is, and it's mentioned 77 times. So that's not some small passing reference. This shows that the Quran author had his mind very much set on the Jerusalem landscape. So, just to recap, conclusion 1, Quran, in my view, presents itself as a continuation of the revelations contained in the Bible. Odon may disagree with whether it's a revelation, but it's part of the biblical universe, the biblical tradition. Conclusion number 2, yes, apocryphon. In the Bible, do apocryphons want to be apocryphons, Odon? Does anyone write an apocryphon saying this is an apocryphon?
Exactly.
Conclusion number 2, in the Bible, Jerusalem is consistently presented as a uniquely sacrosanct place upon the earth and the house of God. Conclusion 3, we can add the Quran presents the Holy Land and the temple as sacred places. And therefore, my overall conclusion is that Jerusalem, being the Quran's unnamed sacred place, is, in my view, the most natural contextualized reading of the Quran. Seems to me that if you discount the Islamic tradition, which I think we have to, for all sorts of other reasons, and one just looks on the text of the Quran, when it talks about the standing place of Abraham and God's house and the sacred place of worship, the natural place one would think of would be Jerusalem, because it frames itself in the biblical paradigm, the biblical worldview, and it would be Jerusalem there. So why not here? For the last last 3 slides, I'd just like to read out 1 or 2 passages from my book, if I may. I've kind of ad-libbed it so far, but I'd like to read 1 or 2 passages from my book. After all, if it were possible to ask Abraham, as he is depicted in the book of Genesis, to identify one location as the most sacred place of worship, he would no doubt identify the land to which he had been led by Yahweh, and within it to indicate one of the 4 altars that he had constructed. Of these 4, it is hard to see how he could have regarded any as being more sacred than the final altar that he built at the precise location pointed out to him by Yahweh himself, where he had faced his most extreme test and where his covenant with God had been sealed by his epic demonstration of faith. If one could pose the same question to biblical Moses, Moses would surely say that notwithstanding his encounters with Yahweh on Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai, the most sacred place of worship was the place in the promised land to which he was leading his people, and which Yahweh had declared in the book of Deuteronomy he would appoint for all Israel to appear before him and offer to him their sacrifices. So Moses himself never went to Jerusalem, or at least not, he didn't walk there. It was forbidden for entering the promised land, but he knew that there was a place that God had said he would set aside for the Israelites and tell him to appoint. And that is, I'm sure, where Moses would regard as the sacred place of worship. Ask David, and he would surely say that it was the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, to which he had been led by the angel of the Lord, and where the angel had told him the temple was to be built. And if one was to ask Solomon, or any Jew after him, at least until the death of Jesus, so including the Jesus and the disciples, they would undoubtedly name the Jerusalem temple, or the site upon which the temple had stood, as being the sacred place of worship. Let us consider an analogy. Suppose that a hitherto unknown cache of documents dating from the ancient world were to come to light, which referred to dozens of figures from the history of Rome, and which consistently framed its messages by reference to such episodes as the city's foundation by Romulus and Remus, the assassination of Julius Caesar and the replacement of the Republic by the Empire, the excesses of Caligula, the reigns of the 5 good emperors, and so on. Suppose that this corpus punctuated these accounts with references to a particular unnamed building of the author's own day, such as a temple, a palace, or an amphitheatre. The natural starting point for any historian to identify the place that the author had in mind would naturally be buildings of that type that were known to have stood in ancient Rome, perhaps one of the temples of the Fori Imperiali, the Capitoline Hill, or in the case of a sports venue, the Circus Maximus or the Colosseum. It would not have been entirely impossible that the author had been an ardent Romanophile and had actually had in his mind a building in North Africa or the Middle East that he had chosen to consistently present throughout his work using well-known classical motifs relating to Rome, confident that his audience would translate these unprompted to their own situation. But this scenario is inherently less likely than that the place the Quran was referring to, that the place that the document was referring to, was to be found within the setting that featured so prominently in its supporting narrative. Or, put another way, the place that the Quran is talking about is the place that the Quran talks about. When it comes to the description of the Masjid al-Haram as Allah's house, logic permits only very limited possibilities. For this not to be Jerusalem either. Option 1, the Jews and the Christians must have been mistaken about where Allah had dwelt. Alternatively, that Allah had dwelt in more than one house. Or option 3, that he had moved his house from one place to another. Nowhere in the Quran is to be found any indication that either the biblical figures who populated surahs nor the Jews and the Christians at the time of his proclamation had been mistaken about the location of Allah's house. On the contrary, the references to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and the temple, and in particular the latter, as a setting for the stories of Zacharias and Mary, implicitly endorse the sacrosanct nature of the Jerusalem temple. Nor does the Quran provide us with any basis upon which to assume that there was a multiplicity of sacred places of worship, that the Kaaba and the Jerusalem temple were both houses of Allah. Bait, in the context of the Quran's most sacred place, always appears in the singular, almost always introduced by the definite article, or in one case, the possessive determiner, this, and frequently without any qualifying adjective at all. As often as not, it is simply referred to as the house. Finally, nowhere is there a hint that God dwelt in Jerusalem, had once dwelt in Jerusalem, but had moved and now dwelt somewhere else. So, my final conclusion, and I can stop sharing at this stage.
Well, actually, maybe you would like to share the screen where you had the links to academia and stuff, so people can actually see it on screen, and for anyone who has just turned up and find it there and so on.
Okay, well, I'll go back to that in a moment. But my final thought is, given the Quran author's self-evident intent to present his own revelations within the pre-existing framework of Judeo-Christian scripture and tradition, by far the most natural, by which I mean the most contextualized reading of the Quran's references to an Abrahamic shrine that he calls a sacred place of worship and Allah's house are that these are references to the Jerusalem temple. This is not to seek to impose an interpretation upon the Quran, which is, I suggest, what has occurred in the now orthodox Meccan Islamic narrative. Rather, it is to draw from the text the meaning that the Quran author took considerable care to embed. Fine.
Bravo, well done. Okay, and that's only a small section of chapter 2.
This is the introduction. This is the introduction to the introduction. So yes, so if anyone's interested, find a website called academia.edu, and if you search on there for Paul Ellis, City of Islam, you will find the open access portion of my book, including everything I've said today and a great deal more besides.
Brilliant. Phenomenal.
Can I stop sharing now? How do I stop sharing?
You have just stopped sharing, actually.
I can't now stop sharing. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That's one thing.
Yeah. Go, Odon.
That's one thing one could add to your final analogy. What would David say? What would Solomon say? What would an early Muslim say?
Yes,
because the earliest tradition of Islam talks about Jerusalem as being, like I told you, the navel of the world and so on. It also talks of Jerusalem as being the place where God, Allah, asked Ibrahim to sacrifice Isaac, and not Ishmael, in Jerusalem. So we have an example in At-Tabari of this tradition, this early tradition depicting Jerusalem as the place of Abraham, the place of the binding, the sacrifice. And so this is here hard evidence that there's something wrong with Mecca, something odd, at least.
Yes, well, ask Abdul Malik. Where did Abdul Malik think was a holy place of worship? Because he makes it clear to everyone to this day where he thought is under the dome of the rock. It's the foundation stone of the temple. So Abdul Malik doesn't care anything about Mecca. Exactly. He builds this grand shrine precisely over the foundation stone of the temple, showing the world to this day where he thought the sacred place of worship was.
Yeah. But like you said, it's just an introduction, because there is so much more material for the Jerusalem thesis and against the Meccan thesis. And
yes, my mission today is not to try and persuade anyone that I've got evidence that it must be Jerusalem. I've got dozens and dozens of arguments for that within my book. At the moment, I'm just setting out the possibility. if you, sometimes I tell people who don't perhaps know very much about the area, that I think the Muslims are all praying in the wrong direction, and they're all praying to Mecca, and they should all pray to Jerusalem. And they look at me with a rather indulgent, humouring kind of, as though I've just come out with some theory that Stonehenge was built by South Americans, or that Jesus went to Australia, or that I've got evidence that there's a double-decker bus on the moon, or something of this sort. As though it's something completely eccentric and unrealistic. But it's simply not true. If one looks at as I say, you look at the role of the Bible to the Quran, the role of Jerusalem in the Bible, and then the references that the Quran does make to the Holy Land and Jerusalem, it is the most natural, smooth conclusion you can draw. One has to really, really have strong evidence to think that it could be anywhere else. All we have is the Islamic narrative, and as Odon, you have shown masterfully on many occasions, the Islamic narrative is totally unworthy of belief. So it's Jerusalem.
Yeah, Jerusalem. And we also have evidence outside of the Islamic tradition. We have sources from the 7th century, for example, telling us that the temple had been rebuilt by an alliance of Jews and Arabs in Jerusalem.
Racing ahead. Racing ahead. So much material to cover.
Yes, that topic in particular, Odon, I saw that you did a presentation on a French channel probably like last month, and I think we need to actually cover that topic on its own, like as soon as possible, as soon as you are available. For people watching, by the way, if you have any questions for Paul or Odon, just put them in the comment section and we can actually address them in a minute. And if you haven't liked and shared and subscribed so far, make sure that you do, because that helps us a lot. And we need to actually get people to understand that Mecca is... there is more reality in Atlantis than there is in Mecca. Let's just put it that way. Everything is just, we know that. And now we're actually trying to see what happened. Certainly, and Paul, about what you said, let me actually make a couple of comments that I think go very well with everything that you have shown. I had completely missed the verse in Surah 17, verse 7, entirely, because normally when I looked at the verses, I looked at when it says Masjid al-Aqsa or Masjid al-Haram. But you're absolutely right there. It says about the two events, the two things, that the two destructions of the temple, or that is certainly the exegesis. And it actually says their masjid. So that would be one connection to, okay, this is talking about temples. You can argue to be synagogues, but a place of prayer, not a mosque. Another one, when we spoke with Murad, I think it was probably a couple of weeks ago, he said that he had traced part of his new research, but he said it publicly, that I think he had traced the word masjid entering Arabic through Ge'ez, and that language, it meant synagogue. So fine. From
I think he might have been talking about mihrab. I think that's. I had a very good discussion with Murad, and we went over this. It was a private discussion. I think it's mihrab, which probably comes from Ge'ez, and in Ge'ez it's used to refer to the synagogue and sometimes to refer to the temple. In fact, one possible etymology, and it's a bit ambitious, but is that mihrab comes from the word cherub, which is it's the land of the cherubs, which is very intriguing, since the cherubs, of course, are known as guarding the gates of paradise, and the great statues of them in the Jerusalem temple and on the Ark of the Covenant. So I think it's mihrab that Murad would say refers to Jerusalem, refers to synagogue. But the
things that now we read, and we have now pretty much been programmed to read everything like it's about Islam, and even with masjid we read it's a mosque. But like you said, it couldn't have been. If it's actually talking about Jerusalem, then it's not going to be it. It's just almost like the programming that we have heard things so many times. But I think as well, as an additional argument, what I would say is if the Islamic narrative didn't have any holes in it, then I would say, oh no, look, what they are saying is absolutely true. But we have seen so many different examples where they try to move things around that we have to approach the topic, anything that comes from Islamic sources, with suspicion at least. So we've seen how they try to make Mecca about Abraham going there. They struggle because there is such a great distance. So, okay, they introduced the Burak. Now, actually, he flew there when they realized that the distance was not doable, like they had already written, of going back and forth. So we've seen that. We've seen with Muhammad, again, flying to Jerusalem and then going to the heavens, night journeys, Surah 17, verse 1. And now we see that that's not about Muhammad at all, it's about Moses. But why did they then have to make Muhammad when he's over there in Mecca and everything is happening in Mecca and the Kaaba is meant to be the temple of God? Why on earth would he be flown all the way to Jerusalem to go to the heavens? Like, Jerusalem means absolutely nothing in the Islamic traditions. They have to shoehorn that one. But when we go to their traditions, we see that that's not the case. Jerusalem was the center of everything. And even on the account of Sebios, that's the reason that the whole thing pretty much begins. They're trying to conquer Jerusalem. So I think when we see that they are trying to make things very Islamic or about Mecca, the argument of saying, okay, nothing to do with Mecca, is about the Holy Land, and most likely most of it is going to be Jerusalem. It becomes stronger because we have caught them on lies so many times that now we are not just taking blindly what they have said because they've been lying.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'm not sure lying. I mean, I'm sure most Muslims genuinely believe what they're saying. But if there was a lie, it was told many, many centuries ago, and people just go with it. Everyone, Jews, Christians, Muslims, or everyone comes to their religion as a child. It's normally is passed on by parents, and people believe what they're told, and then they may well have religious experiences that seem to confirm what they've been told, and so you carry it on from one generation to the next. I don't say the Muslims are all liars, but at some stage, when, for example, this word mihrab, which is so clearly reserved in the Quran as we have it for Jerusalem, and it's used 5 times on all 5 occasions for Jerusalem, relating to 4 different episodes. It seems it's very specific. Now, when they decided to build mosques with an alcove facing towards Mecca, they could have called it any number of things. There's no earthly reason why they had to call it a mihrab. The only reason is because it's borrowing the word that should point people towards Jerusalem and point them in a different direction. And I think I find it hard not to say that there was some dishonesty when that occurred.
And in terms of the prayer, because that is what today is basically pointing at the prayer, or at least in the old days. So do you think that initially, or let's say if we went back to the early 7th century, that the mihrabs, and they would always be pointing at Jerusalem, I think, as we have seen through the Qiblas, and then they changed it? Or do you think that that didn't happen and we are looking at the Qiblas wrongly?
Oh, well, I can do a presentation on that if you like. There's always more to any of these issues. But yes, I think that when the Qibla verse tells believers to pray towards the Masjid al-Haram, it is telling people to pray towards Jerusalem. And when it turns people away from a different direction, that other direction is somewhere else. And I think I've mentioned it on here before. I argue in my book that there's an almost Freudian displacement going on, that when you have the night journey taking somebody from the Masjid al-Haram to a distant place, and if you've got the prayer being changed from somewhere else to the Masjid al-Haram, the Masjid al-Haram for Muslims has to be Mecca. Where is the other place? In both occasions, they choose Jerusalem to be the other place. The night journey becomes a journey to Jerusalem instead of a journey away from Jerusalem. The praying becomes changing the direction from Jerusalem to Mecca instead of from somewhere else to Jerusalem. Whenever they need another place, it's almost as though the tradition where we go, it's almost like a guilty conscience. It's almost a giveaway that they, when they need another place to put in contrast to Mecca, the one place they go to on both occasions is Jerusalem. I think there's a residual memory, or almost Freudian, that they can't, that they give the game away.
Right. And do you join that insistence of praying towards Jerusalem and making Jerusalem like their goal with the account of Sebios of the Arabs and Jews trying to get to Jerusalem? Do you think that those are historically linked, and that's basically how they are inspiring people to let's go to conquer Jerusalem? Or do you think they are completely disjointed?
Well, as I don't want to go too deeply into this now, because I've just presented on my context. I mean, there were many other things on any one of those I could have gone into and said more. So I don't want to just have I don't want to go too far into this. What I would say, though, is for anybody with a mobile telephone with Google Earth as an app, zone in on Mecca, zone in on the Kaaba. Draw a line from there to Jerusalem and see what you spot. And the Kaaba is directed unmistakably, in my view, to Jerusalem. But have a go. Okay, I wonder, I've been chattering away. And any good comments? Has anyone noticed? JC, have you been monitoring communications?
Yeah, most of the comments, well, a couple of them, I have asked the questions when they came in, and otherwise they have been just pretty much comments on the chat. So here Eric is actually saying that Occam's razor is also another way to look at this, by saying all these events took place in the same city, so Jerusalem, and we see that throughout the Quran instead of making contortions of which happens where, which is what we see in the tafsirs, particularly when they are really trying to force everything into Mecca. And then Odon turns up and says there was no water. So,
yes. Yes, I think that's a very good point by Eric. The simple, go for the simplest answer, and the simple answer is Jerusalem. It's the one that just cries out from anyone with knowledge of the Bible, and then the Quran assumes that the audience has knowledge of the Bible. Yes, of course it would have to be Jerusalem. Why? It would have to be so convoluted to cite all these people going to Jerusalem: Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, Zechariah, Mary, to cite one after another of people who regarded Jerusalem as a sacred place, when he really meant it was somewhere else, and not contradicting them or giving any kind of hint that they were in the wrong place. I think that is such a bizarre reading of the Quran. I think anyone reading it would say that that's just not feasible. So then you're then going on to the argument, well, maybe there were two holy places, maybe there was Jerusalem and Mecca. But again, as I'm repeating myself, but there's no evidence. There's no evidence that the Quran thought there were two holy places. Somebody talks about an axis. Somebody talks about an axis of sanctity, an axis between 2 points, and it's an attractive theory. But if you look at the Quran, there's simply no evidence to support it.
You look at history. You made a point, Paul. When you talked about the building of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, why was the first prestige so-called Islamic building built in Jerusalem and not in Mecca?
Yes,
this is something that Robert told us on Lloyd's channel, but it's very simple to understand. He didn't build in Mecca. Even though maybe he knew Mecca, but it was not as important for him as Jerusalem. It was not the place to build the Dome of the Rock.
Yes. Yes,
And he built
when one
nothing
looks,
in Mecca, actually.
when one looks at the Dome of the Rock, one doesn't need really all my PowerPoints and all my arguments, intellectually satisfying as it has been to make them. You just look at the Dome of the Rock, and it's obvious where the Umayyads thought was a holy place, or I wasn't even limited to the Umayyads, just the conquering Arabs, where they thought the holy place was. It's just clear. It's standing there dominating the Jerusalem skyline with a great big golden dome. It doesn't even need a big arrow saying here. It's obvious. The Dome of the Rock, it's got a little mihrab niche on one wall, but that's a late addition. It's not built to point anywhere. It's there to direct people's attention inwards.
And besides, even though there is a mihrab, a niche, people, Muslims, still pray toward the rock. When they are inside the Dome of the Rock, they don't pray towards Mecca, they pray toward the rock. So the rock is the center of the building, and they pray in a circle toward the rock.
The navel of the earth. Navel of the earth.
Yes. We have
that's what the Dome of the Rock symbolizes. That's why people go round and round it, because it's the navel of the earth. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you have read the novel from Edgar Allan Poe, The Letter.
I've read some of Poe's work.
It's a crime story and so on, and the evidence.
The purloined letter.
Maybe it's a purloined letter, but I read it in
Yes.
French. A very good French translation, by the way, and. The evidence for the crime or the murder was sitting in the living room on the chimney. There was a letter. Everybody saw it, but nobody took a good look at it. It was evidence hidden before. It was not hidden, actually. The evidence in the novel, the evidence is there for everyone to read, but it's only in the last pages that it happens. And it's
hidden in plain sight. Absolutely. Hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. Yeah. But the Dome of the Rock is so enormous. It's such a big piece of evidence that people don't realize it is actually evidence. It's the same with the water situation in Mecca. It's enormous. But it's so enormous that people don't think about it this way.
Yeah, and certainly we need to talk about the Dome of the Rock and also all of the traditions, the night journey and so on. Hopefully with Hussein, who was very interested about this topic. Hopefully we can do that soon. But tomorrow we are going to do a second episode with our friend Shai from You Reads Quran. And Paul, he's basically concluding the same things that you are concluding, but from a completely different approach by looking at the Jewish sources, Jewish legends, and seeing that a lot of what the Quran is saying is basically, yes, about the Holy Land, about Abraham, and then some of those things then become the story of Muhammad. So that's why we have all of these parallels and even verses. The one about the night journey is Moses, it becomes Muhammad. The one about breaking the idols, now Muhammad is breaking the idols. What is Muhammad doing in Mecca, where there is no water and there is no people, breaking idols, just like Abraham did. And when you go to the Quran, you see that those verses don't mention Muhammad because he's mentioned only in 4 places. So our friend is actually doing as well all of that digging into the Jewish sources and how those apocryphal stories and legends made it into the Quran. So that is as well like a very, very good show. So I hope that everyone watching will actually tune in tomorrow as we continue, and probably Shai has a lot more material for that. But yeah, everyone I think is concluding at the same thing. It doesn't matter. Before, nobody actually thought about Jerusalem, but once you say, hey, have we considered Jerusalem? It starts to make sense almost immediately, because Mecca just doesn't. But normally with these things, we don't consider the obvious because we have been told a lie so many times that we accept that blindly, basically like Muslims do, but we don't have to do that because we're not Muslims. So yeah, Mecca is pretty much 1000% debunked, and now it looks like Jerusalem was more of a central place in the whole story. So yeah, I look forward to actually continuing with conversations and seeing if we're talking about the history or the sources. I see that in your book you have covered all of the sources, and we need to talk about the early sources, which ones are debunked and they are late, and which ones are actually solid and we can use. So I hope from next week we're going to speak with Lloyd and with Robert and see when people are available, and we'll continue with this conversation to prove how Islam began.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting me, JC.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Paul. It's been a wonderful presentation. I have really enjoyed as well how you put things together. I'm very bad with PowerPoint, so I'm glad to actually have people on who actually know how to use that technology that is beyond my skill level. So well done, and looking forward to the next ones and to reading the book and then commenting and so on. And Odon, thank you very much as well for being here. It's been great. So
I thought my next topic, JC, I don't know if you want to do it next week, would be the elephant. So that would be the next thing. I want to talk about the elephant in the Quran, which is always a topic very close to my heart. So I don't know. Do you think we could do that next week, or should I do that in a future tape?
Well, for me, I'm absolutely fine. You can actually check with Lloyd, because like this, we can do it as well on his show. We can check with Robert, and if I don't know if we had anyone coming in already, like Murad or Robert Spencer or anybody else on Wednesday. But certainly, I would say put the slides together, and we will be ready to go. As soon as possible. We're doing 2 or 3 streams every single week, so we catch up on Monday and we put things on the calendar.
Okay, and to answer the question that Bain Bass just posted, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Gentlemen, any last words for the audience?
I wish Christian spoke more about the temple. That's my last thought. It's very important, to the evangelist, and I think it's often maybe people think it's too difficult for children to understand, and then never get round to it as adults. But yeah, part of the result of my research of this is it's a very useful, very inspiring way of thinking about Jesus, because that's the way the evangelists described him.
Okay, I would just say that the emperor is naked, and someone has to tell it to the world.
Yes, all he's got is a fig and an olive to cover his modesty.
Well, you're saying that the emperor is naked. I'm saying there was no emperor, but potato, potato. Well, thank you very much, Odon, Paul. Great presentation. Looking forward to the next one, and hopefully you actually read out the whole book, and then it's an audiobook. That would be wonderful as well. You have a wonderful voice. People watching, thank you very much. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and come back tomorrow where we actually continue exploring Mecca from a different angle. And next week we will continue as well the discussions. Let's see how much we can uncover. Stay tuned, stay well, and God bless you all. Bye-bye.